Statement, Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with permission, I would like to make a statement about the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. In July 2024, I paused further commencement of the Act in response to concerns raised by a cross-section of voices. I took that decision because it is vital that we get this right. Our universities are one of this country's greatest strengths, and I know members from across this House share my pride in a sector that is truly world-leading. And at that centre of that excellence sits academic freedom and freedom of speech. The ability of our academics to explore and express new ideas through teaching and research is precious, and we must protect it. And Madam Deputy Speaker, these fundamental freedoms are more important, much more important, than the wishes of some students not to be offended. University is a place for ideas to be exposed and debated, to be tried and tested. For young people, it is a space for horizons to be broadened, perspectives to be challenged, and for ideas to be examined. It is not a place for students to shut down any view with which they disagree. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this issue, here is our starting point. Academic freedom matters, freedom of speech matters, and we will preserve those two pillars of national strength. But we will proceed in a way that actually works. That's why we have carried out extensive engagement, covering all corners of the debate. Academics, universities, students, those for the Act and those against, all voices were heard. And I was especially keen to consider the views of minority groups, to learn how the Act might affect them, particularly given the shocking rise in anti-Semitism that we have seen on campus. Madam Deputy Speaker, standing here in this great chamber of debate, I remain resolute about the importance of free speech. But our engagement on the Act has raised concerns that any responsible government must take seriously. What was being proposed simply did not rise to the challenge. Unworkable duties on student unions, a tort clogging up the court system, and the Office for Students obliged to consider a vast number of complex complaints. And there are also serious concerns over the impact the Act could have on the welfare of minority groups. Many are worried that it could lead to increased harassment and discrimination on campus, and that the Act could push providers to overlook their safety. I share their concerns. In addition, I want to reiterate that I am appalled by the rise in anti-Semitism on campus. In my view, rising anti-Semitism is best tackled through education about the issue. That is why I have confirmed £7 million of funding to tackle anti-Semitism in schools, colleges and universities. I have reached a way forward, which I believe is effective and proportionate, delivering an Act that is fair and workable. My decisions, subject to agreement from Parliament, will make sure our higher education sector and the Office for Students continue to protect academic freedom and freedom of speech whilst ensuring the safety of minority groups. I'm proposing to implement key elements of the Act and to return others to Parliament for decision on their amendment or repeal. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm proposing shortly to commence the following requirements currently in the Act. The duties on higher education providers to take reasonably practicable steps to secure and promote freedom of speech within the law. The duty on higher education providers to put in place a code of conduct on freedom of speech. The ban on non-disclosure agreements for staff and students at higher education providers in cases of bullying, harassment and sexual misconduct. I also plan to commence the duties on the OFS to promote freedom of speech and the power to give advice and share best practice. I will be retaining the Director of Free Speech and Academic Freedom role, and I'm pleased that Dr Ahmed will be staying on. I have complete confidence in Dr Ahmed, but in my view, it is not right for this position to be a political appointee. They should hold a deep belief in free speech and academic freedom, of course they should, but their independence matters, and so their appointment must be free from any suspicion of political bias. Sir David Behan's review of the OFS, commenced under the last government, recommended that we reconsider how all OFS executive and board appointments should be made, and I will decide on this shortly. Madam Deputy Speaker, while there is much in the Act that is valuable, there are other provisions which I do not believe are proportionate or necessary, which will drain resources from providers and distract from other important issues they face. It is therefore my intention to return to Parliament to seek repeal of two provisions. The first is the duties on student unions in the Act. Students' unions are neither equipped nor funded to navigate such a complex regulatory environment, and they are already regulated by the Charity Commission. However, I fully expect students' unions to protect lawful free speech, whether they agree with the views expressed or not. And I expect HE providers to work closely with them to make sure that happens, to act decisively to make sure their students' union complies with their free speech code of conduct. The second provision I seek to repeal is the tort. I've heard the views in favour of the tort and I understand the arguments being made. However, it would create costly litigation that risks diverting resources away from students at a time when university finances are already strained. Madam Deputy Speaker, members can be assured that the remaining routes of redress have plenty of teeth. The Office for Students will have powers to take tough regulatory action where universities and colleges do not meet their duties. And ultimately, an Act needs to be workable for its teeth to bite. So I ask members opposite, how would they rather our universities spend their time and resources? By lawyering up or by focusing on high-quality teaching and groundbreaking research? In fact, the fear of litigation could hurt rather than help free speech. Universities may decide against inviting challenging speakers to avoid ending up in court, and nobody wants that. But I have a message for Vice-Chancellors who fail to take this seriously. Protect free speech on your campuses or face the consequences. For too long, too many universities have been too relaxed about these issues. Too few took them seriously enough, and that must change. There are other elements of the Act that I am planning to retain, but to amend with parliamentary agreement. I'm proposing to keep a complaint scheme in place with the OFS. It is an important route of redress for anyone whose academic freedom or free speech has not been protected. There must be a route for righting wrongs, but it must be proportionate, so that the OFS has the power to consider complaints rather than a duty to assess every single complaint it receives, even those that are poorly put together or nonsensical. This way, the OFS will be freed up to prioritise the most serious complaints. I also want to remove the confusing duplication of complaint schemes for students. The Office of the Independent Adjudicator can already consider student complaints on free speech and will continue to do so. The OFS complaint scheme will focus on complaints from staff, external speakers and university members. I will also amend the OFS's mandatory condition of registration to give them flexibility in how they apply this condition to different types of providers. The OFS should have the room to determine the best way to regulate on a case-by-case basis. This is the only way to deliver a sensible system that actually works. Finally, I will take more time to consider implementation of the overseas funding measures. I remain fully committed to tackling cases of interference by overseas governments, and the wider measures in this Act will further strengthen our protections. However, I want to ensure that any new reporting requirements for providers add value without being overly burdensome. This is as we work at pace with the sector on the wider implementation of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. My officials are working across government and with the sector to review our response, and I will confirm my final decision in due course. Finally, I intend to draft a policy paper to set out these proposals in more detail, and I will return to this House when it is ready. Where I am returning matters to Parliament, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will keep them under review in the meanwhile. Madam Deputy Speaker, our universities are leading lights of learning. They are spaces for vigorous discussion, places where people of all ages, faiths and backgrounds can come together to debate new ideas. And I want to call on universities to promote a culture of disagreeing well. There is already excellent work going on across the sector, but we must see more. And let me be clear, students have a duty as well, to embody that spirit of debate which makes our universities great, not to simply try and cancel any views with which they disagree. This government will secure freedom of speech in legislation that is practical, proportionate and workable. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, legislation alone will never be enough. Freedom of speech isn't easy. It's not just a right, it is a responsibility. If we want a culture of debate that is robust yet respectful, challenging yet considerate, strong yet civil, then we must all do our part to nurture it. The Freedom of Speech Act provides a legal framework, but it is up to all of us every day to build a culture of truly free speech. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State Laura Trott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her statement. The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 was passed by Parliament prior to the election. By the end of its passage through both houses, the Labour Party had agreed in principle with the need for the Act, and indeed there are positive signals coming from the front bench today. However, immediately after the election, government sources said the Act was, and I quote, a Tory hate speech charter, and paused its implementation. So, I asked the Secretary of State, what has changed? Does the Secretary of State still stand by her characterisation of the bill? Madam Deputy Speaker, it should have been obvious straight away to anyone with even a basic sympathy for the norms of liberal education that pausing the Act was a mistake. It should have been clear again when over 650 academics signed a letter to the Times decrying the decision that pausing the Act was a mistake. But the Secretary of State still did not budge from her position. It should have been undeniable that the government had made the wrong choice when, acting together, no less than 7 Nobel Prize winners and a Fields medalist later added their names to that letter. But still, the party opposite were happy to roll out the old tropes about hate speech. Literary luminaries like Sir Stephen Fry, Tom Holland and Ian McEwan were forced to intervene. Those with natural sympathies to the Secretary of State's own political positions were compelled into telling her that she was wrong. And it's only now, after all that humiliation, that she's finally changed her footing. And I pay tribute to the academics who have led that fight back outside of Parliament. Much like they've done with the academies in the Children Wellbeing in Schools Bill, this government take a wrecking ball to policy without thought for the consequences. They are much more interested in virtue signalling than what is right for the country, more interested in listening to student union advisers than women hounded out of their jobs. Since the Secretary of State decided to pause this legislation, gender-critical women, amongst others, have, in the process of vindicating their rights, racked up enormous legal fees that have caused some to remortgage their houses. Professor Joe Phoenix said publicly that if it had been enforced, the Act would have saved her from this very ordeal. So will the Secretary of State now apologise to those who have suffered because of her inaction? And we have the upcoming legal action, the judicial review brought by the Free Speech Union against the government's decision. Considering a concern about expense was one of the reasons given by the government to justify its decision, how much has that litigation cost to defend? What is the financial cost of her inaction? How much taxpayer money has been spent on a partisan, play-up-to-your-own-gallery move which is about to fall flat on its face in the court? And did the Secretary of State receive legal advice before she made her decision to suspend the Higher Education Act? Will she release it so members of this House can see the basis upon which she acted? And if she did not, how can she possibly claim to have acted responsibly in this matter? And, Madam Deputy Speaker, despite the Secretary of State's statement, we now have confusion about what is actually happening. It seems this government can't even do a much-needed U-turn properly. Without the tort, what are the consequences that universities will face if they don't protect free speech? Why is the Secretary of State unable to set out a clear decision on overseas funding? Why is 6 months not enough time? Can the Secretary of State spell out the changes they are thinking about making to the overseas funding measure? Can she confirm that none of these were discussed in the Chancellor's recent visit to China? And can she confirm that there were no deals done to amend this clause? This is very important, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is extremely poor timing at best and invidious at worst to consider changes to the overseas funding element of the Act so soon after this trip to China. Madam Deputy Speaker, apologies. It was always obvious that the Education Secretary made a mistake in pausing this bill. But rather than commencing a little more of the Act to try and cover up the mistake and delay, the Secretary of State needs to get up and perform the U-turn in full. The Act contains much-needed protections, and she must not abolish them just because they come from this side of the House. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, while we're at it, the Secretary of State should perform a U-turn on the Academy freedoms too. They must not take 6 months to realise their mistake on that one.
Minister, Secretary of State. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What we inherited from the last government was not a genuine attempt to solve a genuine problem. It was a mess, designed to put party ahead of country. We saw a misplaced fascination with headlines for themselves rather than for a serious attempt to safeguard freedom of speech and academic freedom. And it's precisely because this government cares about academic freedom and freedom of speech that we are determined to get this right, unlike the party opposite. We are not content to leave it to Vice-Chancellors who have done too little for too long. Universities must be places of robust discussion where students' views are challenged, where academic freedom is central. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, one of my many predecessors under the last government, the former member for Chippenham, was unable to set out how the then government's proposals would prevent Holocaust deniers coming on to campus. Let me be clear, Holocaust denial has no place on campus or anywhere else in our society, and the previous legislation would have emboldened Holocaust denial and showed a shameful disregard for the welfare of Jewish students. And on the legal proceedings that the Right Honourable Lady mentions, she was a member of government and she knows very well that I am unable to comment on any aspect of this. Madam Deputy Speaker, I said I would consider all options. I have done precisely that, and I have returned to the House, as I intended, to provide an update. If members opposite want to know what a U-turn on free speech looks like, I suggest they turn their attention to Liz Truss, who for so long extolled the virtues of free speech and is now on some kind of bizarre quest to cancel the Prime Minister for saying that she and the party opposite crashed the economy. Freedom of speech cuts both ways. What a bunch of snowflakes.
The Chair of the Education Select Committee, Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for confirming the Government's approach to the implementation of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, and I welcome the clarity that she has provided today. The implementation of this Act will present some challenges for universities and for students. The Secretary of State will know that there can sometimes be a fine line between free speech and hate speech, and between statements of views and opinions and incitement or encouragement to violence or intimidation in the real world. Can she give assurances to the House that she will ensure that universities and students are absolutely clear about the limits to free speech which are already enshrined in law, and that support will be provided on the interpretation of that where needed? Professor Satish Kapoor, Vice-Chancellor and President of King's College London, has said universities are not there to function as a speaker's corner where anyone can stand up and express an opinion not necessarily supported by facts. If academic freedom is to mean anything, it must be accompanied by the academic obligation for ideas and claims to be accompanied by evidence and reason. Proponents have an obligation to engage and respond to those questioning their assertions and conduct that debate and discourse in a civil manner. So I want to ask finally, how will the Secretary of State ensure, particularly as we are seeing happening in front of our eyes at the moment, the erosion of fact-checking and moderation on social media, that the implementation of this Act results in a high quality of evidence-based discourse conducted in a culture of civility?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to the Chair of the Select Committee for the questions that she has asked and for the way in which she has approached it. And I, of course, look forward to discussing these issues with the Select Committee in due course, should they wish. To the point that she raises about disagreeing, well, I think that is important. Free speech should be robust. We should be able to express our views. But, of course, all of us, especially those in public life, have a responsibility to make sure we are doing so in a way that is responsible. Where it comes to the tort, and this does come to the heart of the issue that she has identified, I was concerned that the potential impact of legal proceedings and the financial consequences for providers of breaching their duties under the Act might have led to some providers unduly prioritising free speech which is hateful or degrading over the interests of those who feel harassed and intimidated. And these issues can be very finely balanced. We will bring further clarity in this area through the Office for Students. But let me be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, academic freedom and freedom of speech are crucial tenets of our country's history.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Ian Sollom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for advancing the statement too. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Liberal Democrats fully support free speech, which is, as several have said today, at the heart of academic freedom. But it was clear from the start that this piece of legislation was not based on evidence, was not proportionate and, frankly, fundamentally flawed. So we welcome the pausing of its implementation last year. And I welcome again now the acknowledgement of those flaws and her move to repeal the provisions on the tort and on student unions in particular. But I would still press the Secretary of State on the fundamental question of why this Act is necessary. Higher education institutions already operate within a legal framework to ensure freedom of speech within the law is secured for academic staff, students, employees and visiting speakers. And universities have already taken action to improve their policies and processes around freedom of speech. Universities UK, which represents over 140 universities, has reissued and expanded its own guidance in this area, as well as having regular discussions with university leaders to support them on these challenges. So would the Secretary of State consider that a more meaningful step to ensure students are safe, welcome and protected at universities would be to give higher education institutions a statutory duty of care to their students? The Secretary of State has also mentioned the well-documented fears of minority groups, particularly those in Jewish communities, that the Act in its previous form would allow a platform for extremist views and, as she mentioned, Holocaust denial. Now, we've had some indication in her statement, but Madam Deputy Speaker, will the Secretary of State provide more detail of those plans to protect those minority groups and communities on university campuses? Thank you.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the questions that he raises. I'll start where we disagree and perhaps move on to where I would disagree with him on some of the points that he has raised. I agree that freedom of speech and academic freedom are essential. However, I think, sadly, we have seen too many examples of where that has not been upheld in the way that it should be by universities. And I do recognise that the Right Honourable Lady mentioned and raised a number of cases where we have seen unacceptable practice, where some individuals have had to seek recourse through employment law, but where it should have been possible to seek redress sooner. That is precisely what we are seeking to do, in ensuring that the Office for Students are able to focus on the most serious of cases without getting caught up in complex cases that could be less well-founded or nonsensical. And I just want to be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we have engaged with a range of views on these topics, including those who hold gender-critical views, including those who were in favour of the legislation, those who had concerns. And it has been through that careful process of engagement with the sector, with stakeholders, with people with a range of views, that I'm able to come to this House today and set out our approach.
Select Committee Member Mark Sewards.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the statement that the Secretary of State has made today? It's good to see that our universities are no longer going to be a battleground for political parties to seek to make headlines from. Unsuccessfully, I might add. Now, does she agree with me that now that she's taken decisive action on this issue, it's time to talk about the financial situation that faces our universities and threatens many of them with their very existence? We also know that students are paying far more for far less in university, and we need to end that ridiculous cycle too.
Secretary of State.
I agree with the honourable gentleman that across the board there are big challenges in the university sector. It's why I took the difficult but necessary decision last year to increase the rate of fee that they are able to charge. But going into this year, we will be engaging in reform right across the sector to provide the long-term financial sustainability that is required, because we on these benches, as my honourable gentleman recognises, are clear that our universities are a central part of our economy, local and regional, and a beacon of excellence around the world. It is why so many students from across the globe seek to come to our world-leading universities.
Select Committee Member Dr Caroline Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I respect the Secretary of State's wish to ensure that she had considered the bill thoroughly. I regret that it's taken quite so long to come to the conclusion that free speech is important, but I am glad that she's decided to bring in and enforce many of the measures in that Conservative bill. She has, however, chosen to exclude student unions from the legislation, and I wonder if she could say a bit more about how they will be held to account if they fail to keep in line with her desire to promote free speech.
On the timescale, this is a complex area, but in little over 6 months, we have consulted a wide range of stakeholders, considered all views, and that is why I'm able to return to this House today to update members. On the provisions around student unions, the Honourable Lady is right that we have decided not to commence provisions that will impose new duties on student unions. That's because some smaller providers only had a handful of members and would have not had the resource or funding necessary to handle such claims, and they are already regulated by the Charity Commission. However, we fully expect student unions to protect freedom of speech and for providers to ensure that their student unions do so as well.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome the careful and considered approach the Secretary of State has taken on this issue, which stands in stark contrast to when this bill was first brought forward. And I refer the Shadow Secretary of State and indeed the House to my comments in Hansard from the 30th of May 2021, when the previous Secretary of State explicitly confirmed on Radio 4 that Holocaust denial would be protected speech. And in that vein, does my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, share the concerns of groups like the Union of Jewish Students and the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust that the draft guidelines which had previously been produced by the Office for Students risked undermining existing good practice in tackling anti-Semitism? And will she give her assurance that they will meet with the OFS, Jewish representative organisations, to ensure these mistakes could not be repeated?
State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm confident that the OFS, as the regulator and the Director of Free Speech, will be seeking to engage with a range of views, including Jewish students and community organisations, as they take forward this important work. This is certainly something that I myself have done to understand the concerns and potential impact on minority students, including Jewish students, at a time when we all sadly know that anti-Semitism on our campuses and on our streets has been rising, and we must do everything within our power as a country to tackle that.
Graham Stuart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This screeching U-turn is welcome, and I hope, as the Shadow Secretary of State says, that it heralds a new period of humility and further change by the government. But the Secretary of State said that universities must protect free speech or face the consequences. But as far as I can see, the Secretary of State has removed those consequences. Could you please lay them out for us?
I know the right honourable gentleman is probably used to his party opposite engaging in these discussions on quite difficult and sensitive issues in a rather reckless and irresponsible way. But on these benches, we take our time to do this seriously and properly to make sure that we get it right, because this is such an important area. The right honourable gentleman will have heard from the speech, and I will set out further detail on this, around the requirements that will be in place through registration conditions, the fact that the Office for Students will be able to impose penalties on institutions, and on the requirements that we do expect of all higher education providers. And my message to Vice-Chancellors and to institutions today is that they need to do more and they need to do it better.
Select Committee Member Darren Paffey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank my right honourable friend for her statement and for the measured and practical and common sense approach that this takes, which is in sharp contrast to what we're hearing on the opposition benches at the moment. While we will always defend the right to people's opinions, the right to your own facts is rather regrettable, and their revisionism is quite astounding. Madam Deputy Speaker, I know firsthand the value of university education. It is about having your views challenged. It is about critical thinking based on evidence and facts and having your horizons open. Does the Minister agree that this foundation and the measures announced today are the right way to secure academic freedom in the future?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend, through his background in higher education, knows all too well how essential it is that young people and students from a range of different backgrounds are exposed to views that they might not previously have heard, that they might find difficult or challenging. That is what a university education is all about. That is what we are determined to secure and protect through the statement that I'm making today.
We have substantial business to get through today before the House rises. So if questions are short, I can get everybody in. If they're not, then people are going to be disappointed. So Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And can I thank
Secretary of State for coming to the House and setting out the revised position of the government. I'm particularly concerned about the removal of the tort because it effectively removes the real consequences for people who sort of disregard free speech, and actually how that there can be a consequence imposed on that institution or that organisation. If that is going to be the case, can the Secretary of State set out to the House what resources are going to be dedicated to the Director of Free Speech? Let's hope this isn't just a fig leaf, one person, but how many people are going to be working for them? What resource is going to be there to make sure that free speech is protected? Yeah.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman, the former Secretary of State. He will appreciate that as an independent regulator, there's a limit to what I can set out on their behalf. But on the key issue of the tort, there will be consequences, even following the removal of the tort, for those providers who do not fulfil their duties under the Act. The OFS can already regulate providers in relation to free speech. They will be able to take regulatory action where there are breaches of the duties under the Act, including monetary penalties if needed. And the complaints scheme will enable the OFS to make recommendations to providers that will be expected to follow. Existing routes of redress through judicial reviews and employment tribunals will remain open, but we want the OFS to focus on making sure that there is a system in place that is workable so that complaints can be dealt with swiftly.
Chris Vince.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Secretary of State for this statement. I think freedom of speech is really important, but I would say, as it is most of the time in this place, that this should be done in an environment of shared respect. Can I welcome this pragmatic approach to the process, and will she confirm the previous unworkable legislation would have added additional financial stress to institutions?
Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important that any legislation in this area is fair, proportionate and workable. That is what we have sought to do through the wide engagement and consultation that has taken place since July when I paused commencement. It's vital that we get it right. It is incredibly important, and today we have given clarity to the sector around expectations into the future.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Speaker, and I welcome the words from the Secretary of State around freedom of speech today. She knows I was asked about this in the House previously, and I also welcome the partial U-turn. Would she join me, though, in thanking the academics who've really put pressure, I think, on this government to get to this position, and also the work of the Free Speech Union? Would she encourage all academic institutions to sign up to the Chicago principles? Could you give us a brief timeline on when the foreign influence registration scheme could come forward? And finally, I'm setting up the APPG on freedom of speech in the coming weeks. Would the Secretary of State agree at some point to come along and speak to us about this in the future?
Yeah, Secretary of State. That's a
I'm afraid I didn't quite catch the very last part of the right honourable gentleman, but I will happily look back in Hansard and return to him on that point.
Yes to attending a meeting.
I'm not going to do that, I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, without having reviewed exactly what he said. I know the right honourable gentleman quite well. The Department for Education and the Home Office are looking jointly at some of these areas, and I just want to be clear that national security is our #1 priority as a government. I am grateful to all of those who have engaged in good faith with the Department in this conversation, those that hold a wide range of views, those for the Act, those against, those with views perhaps somewhere in the middle and with some nuance too. I am grateful for their contributions to this discussion. I hope that they can all see that we have taken this seriously and we now have a workable plan to make sure that freedom of speech and academic freedom in our institutions are protected into the future.
Matthew Patrick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Frank Field is a very good friend of mine, and he believed deeply in seeking out disagreement with other people for a richer conversation and the importance of listening in good faith to arguments made in good faith. Does my right honourable friend agree that is a spirit we should see across university campuses, and will she set out how her Act will make sure that that is a reality?
Absolutely. I think that is something that we can all learn from. His predecessor brought wisdom on a range of areas, and I think this is one where all of us can reflect on the need to constantly keep our views under review to make sure that we challenge ourselves, and the chance to be educated, whether that's through school, college or university, is a crucial part of how we challenge ourselves, we understand the world in all of its many forms, and the measures today will allow for students within university to have precisely that experience.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement and indeed welcome it. I would particularly like to welcome the emphasis on reducing burdens for universities, which will mean a lot to smaller institutions such as smaller research-intensive institutions like Reading University in my constituency. Could she commit to the Department continuing to work with smaller research-intensive institutions?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the many brilliant aspects of the higher education sector in our country is its diversity. The smaller institutions, larger, those that bring a wealth of difference and that have evolved and changed in different ways. And we will continue to listen to and work with providers and institutions of all shapes and sizes right across our country.
Gareth Snell.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start with the congratulations to the Shadow Secretary of State for the sheer audacity of coming to this place and pretending to be the party of free speech when it was her party that introduced the Transparency and Lobbying Act in 2014 that was the single largest restriction on free speech in the charity and voluntary sector, purely because they were saying things that the government at the time didn't want to hear. So can I encourage the Secretary of State to ignore the whines and the whinges, the gripes and the groans of the party opposite and carry on with what she's doing, because she's absolutely right. Universities are where you challenge new ideas and you hear things that you may disagree with. But can I ask what advice she's giving to universities about the support they put in place for students so when they are exploring these new ideas and being challenged in their own views, they can do so in a way that is safe and secure?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. Freedom of speech does cut both ways, and members on the benches opposite would sometimes do well to reflect on that too. I think it is right that sometimes when students can be exposed to views that they find challenging or more difficult, especially perhaps younger students newly away from home, that we do have the right support put in place. It's why that I know institutions have been investing a lot where it comes to mental health support and other provision. But I think it also underlines the need to turn around the provision that is there within the National Health Service, because I am concerned about the extent to which providers are having to put in place additional support above and beyond what should be a statutory requirement for every member of our country.
Joni Reid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement, and I particularly welcome the funding for tackling anti-Semitism on campuses, a problem which is well documented. When the original guidance for the Act was published, it took an approach to free speech that did not take into account the limitations of freedom of expression for minority groups which arise from hate speech. As the chair of the all-party group against anti-Semitism, I'm particularly concerned about the risk of giving that hate implicit protection and amplification on campuses. Can the Secretary of State assure me and other minority community representatives that have raised this issue with us that any future guidance will more carefully outline the importance of expression for all, including minority groups, sometimes crowded out by loud, hateful voices?
Secretary of State.
I will ensure that the point my honourable friend raises is taken up, and to the very serious concern that many have raised around anti-Semitism on campus and the impact on Jewish students, I can see no good reason why any university would invite a Holocaust denier onto campus to deny the overwhelming evidence that the Holocaust is an appalling form of anti-Semitism. And just yesterday, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was able to join the Holocaust Educational Trust within Parliament to make sure that as we come to the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, we redouble our efforts to fight hatred and prejudice, including anti-Semitism, wherever we find it in our country.
Luke Moyer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I welcome the statement from my honourable friend today. I declare an interest not only as someone who's worked in the sector, but also as a member of the Freedom of Expression organisation English Pen, who condemned the approach of the previous government because they felt that it would restrict academic freedom. And indeed, my constituent, a well-regarded economist, lost his job after publishing research into the impact of migration on coalfield communities. So can my honourable friend, the Secretary of State, assure my constituent that this is a government that is committed to academic freedom and committed to ensuring the stability of academic institutions?
I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and that is also why, as one of the measures that I intend to return to, we must look again at the board appointments and executive appointments to the Office for Students, because I think it is right that concerns have been raised that there could be the suspicion of political interference, given that rather unusually for that kind of appointment, it is a political appointee. Now, people might regard that as fine if they agree with the views of the government of the day, but I do not think that is a good principle on which we enshrine in law very important positions that are central to how we uphold academic freedom and freedom of speech in this country.
Adam Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Secretary of State for her statement today, particularly in regards to the removal of the tort from the existing legislation. I think this is going to allow our universities to ensure that funds get spent on students and not on complex legal issues. As the Secretary of State has said repeatedly today, this government takes the need to expose students to a wide range of issues very seriously. Does the Secretary of State agree with me, as a former academic, that our universities must remain centres of robust, rigorous debate always?
Yeah. Secretary of State.
Yes, that is crucial, and we know that the chance to study at university is life-changing for so many students. Yes, of course, younger students, perhaps those that have what might be considered the more traditional experience of going to university at 18, but also the chance right throughout your life to have the opportunity to return to education and to training. And that is what I have seen across so many institutions in our country, the fantastic opportunities they put in place for upskilling, for retraining, for later on in life, thinking again about how you want to go about things. And I praise their fantastic work in driving growth and innovation, and in the months to come we will work with them to ensure that they can do more.
Lawrence Turner.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I invite the Secretary of State to respond to the statement by the Union of Jewish Students made while she was on her feet as follows. We support the changes brought forward by the Secretary of State. She has listened to the concerns we and others raised and has taken action. The result is that the Act will now be less likely to damage efforts to tackle anti-Jewish racism on campus. That should be welcomed by everyone.
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for sharing those comments, and I pay tribute to the Union of Jewish Students for the amazing work that they do every day to support Jewish students on campus and to ensure that their voices are heard, including at the highest levels of government. And I give my commitment to UJS that I will continue to work with them, with other student groups, to make sure that their voice is always heard and that we as a government are resolutely behind them in the fight against anti-Semitism in our country.
Final question, Dr Scott Arthur.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As someone who was an academic until about 5 a.m. on the 5th of July last year, I want to thank the Secretary of State for her statement and also for the leadership she's shown on this issue. But I do ask my question within the context of my register of interest. I'm proud of all the universities in Edinburgh and how they attract students from all over the world. But last year when I visited the Edinburgh Hebrew congregation, which is the main synagogue in Edinburgh, I was ashamed to hear of the intimidation Jewish students were facing in university. I was pleased to hear the universities are taking it seriously, and I know that Edinburgh Interfaith Forum is too. Freedom of speech is an important right, but that should never extend to bigotry and hate. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that students should always be free to practice their faith, always, and also be able to display their faith publicly, no matter what it is, without fear of intimidation?
Secretary of State.
That is absolutely essential, and the same is true for Jewish students and others from minority groups as they travel about, as they go about their business, as they go to school and college. And sadly, I've heard too many examples of abuse and intimidation in the way that my honourable friend describes. Universities must be robust places of intellectual challenge and rigour, but there is no good reason why students should feel intimidated or harassed in a place where they should find comfort and challenge and support.
That concludes that element of business.